heard a little rumor about you. Someone told me you might have a leaky box. It's okay. I'm not here to judge. I won't tell anyone, don't worry. You should probably get that looked at. Or just stay right here and I'll show you some ways that you might be able to fix it. What? Your steering box. What do you think I was talking about? This right here is the steering box out of this 31 coupe. Now when I bought this car, every fluid in this thing leaked, and I mean everything. It dripped engine oil, dripped transmission oil, leaks coolant, but by far the worst leak was the steering box. This thing, I would fill it, and within a week and a half, it was empty. Now these things run that 600 weight, which is a really thick gear oil, and even with that in it, it still leaked out in a very short amount of time. This is another steering column and box that I just had laying around, so we'll use this for demonstration purposes. Now there's two primary spots where these things usually leak. First off, and this is the main area where they usually leak, is down on the bottom here where your headlight switch attaches. The other area is on the sector shaft between the shaft and the housing. So first off, like I said, the primary area where they leak is this bottom plate. Now this is the disassembled version. This plate mounts on here like this, and this is in behind it. This tube is actually the improved version to stop the leak. The original part only had this bottom piece. So you had this seal right here. This is a resealing kit. This seal was supposed to seal between that piece and your horn rod, which comes down through to operate your headlight switch. So that's usually where they leak. Oil comes down through there, it ends up filling up your headlight switch, and then your lights get all janky and things don't work right, and it's just a big disaster. So someone had already addressed that on this car where they put this longer version in, which brings the tube up above the oil level in the box. So now there's no way for oil to get down between the horn rod and this. So it takes care of that issue. My car obviously wasn't leaking from that spot because it already had this in it. So the other area where they leak is between the sector housing and the sector shaft. Now there's no seal in there. It's a brass bushing, and they rely on a tight tolerance to stop the oil from running out, which is great until they start to get a little bit of wear in that bushing and in the shaft. Then you've got a pretty good gap there where oil can leak out. Now this is the sector housing off of this car over here, and as you can see, it's just got this bronze bushing. Now they do make these kits here, which is just a rubber seal and a large thin washer that would just slide right on over that seal first and then the washer, and then it gets sandwiched between the frame and this, and that is supposed to help seal that up. I've never used this. I just have a few on hand in case someone needs one. So I'm not sure how well these actually work. On this car, I opted to do the better fix. This is a remanufactured sector housing that's been machined to accept a roller bearing and a seal, as you can see there. When you compare that to the original one, you can see the seal and the bearing in there and just the bronze bushing in there. So that should do two things. First off, make the steering a little smoother, but also remedy the oil leak. Now, once you buy one of these through Snyder's, they have an exchange program where you can send them your old sector housing and they'll rebuild it. Or I believe you can just buy this new as well. So this is the box out of the coupe. I already had it all disassembled, but I'll show you real quick how it comes apart. You just got 4 nuts right on here, then the sector housing comes right off, obviously once you have the whole thing out of the vehicle. Sector housing pulls off, sector shaft comes right out. You want to clean this area. There's a little cork gasket that goes in here, and you also want to make sure that this adjusting piece here is free to move around. This one wasn't. I had to get in here with a screwdriver and just work it back and forth for a little bit to finally get it freed up. But you want to do that while the housing's off. Make it a lot easier in case you do have to adjust that. You probably won't if you're using all the same parts again, but you may have to. So just in case, make sure that's freed up. You want to get in here and clean that out a little bit. Get your new cork gasket that comes in the reseal kit, and that's going to sit right in there. You just want to put a real light coating of oil or grease or something on the top side of that so that the sector housing can move around if it has to once you put it back together. So we got our cork gasket in here. I just put a real thin layer of grease on there. Take your sector shaft. If that's in good shape and reusable, just clean it up. Make sure your little thrust washer thing is on there. And I just lubricate the shaft of it with some of this. It's the 600 weight that lubricates the box. This stuff right here. And just set it right down in there. I'm going to take your new sector shaft housing, or the old one if you're reusing it. I probably should have painted this, but I forgot to. I'll do it once it's back together. So you want to throw a little bit of lube in here too, because you've got those roller bearings on that end and that seal. So you want to make sure that don't go to get it dry. So I just poured a little bit of the oil into each end of the bearing here and just worked it into it a little bit. I'm pretty sure they were packed with some kind of assembly grease to begin with, so I'm sure they're not in there dry, but never hurts to have a little extra. And make sure that seal gets a good coating. You don't want that running dry. You should just be able to set it right back on there. Make sure your cork gasket's in place. Should be a fairly tight fit going over that seal. There you go. Double check your gasket, make sure it hasn't moved. Set it right down over it, just like that. So once you got your shaft and housing set on, you'll take this little eccentric adjusting thing, and it goes in this large hole here. You may have to pop that out of your old housing if you're using a new one. And I just try to orient it in the same direction that it was originally in. I don't know if it should get you fairly close to the correct adjustment. Then you get the little tapered piece that goes into that, and drop that in there as well. Now if you haven't already removed this, you'll want to take the sector shaft end play adjustment bolt completely out before you tighten this housing down. You don't want to sandwich that in there, have this be too tight. So it's best to just take it out or put in a couple threads so you don't lose it, but just make sure it's backed way off before you go tightening this housing down. So once your sector housing is back on and all tightened up, before you go putting that end play adjustment screw back in, you want to check that surface where it rides on the end of the sector shaft. A lot of times they'll have a little burr or something on them, which this one does, plus it's a little bit dirty. I would just take a piece of sandpaper, put it on a good flat surface like this anvil, and just kind of run it back and forth. Take that off and it'll be plenty good enough for that. There, a nice clean surface to right against the end of the sector now. So once the end of your adjustment screw is all nice and cleaned up, go ahead and put it back in there. Back the nut off all the way, obviously. You want to just keep tightening that up. And then checking your end play on this, so just pull the shaft in and out. Still got a tiny bit of play in it. And just keep tightening that screw a little at a time till it just takes all the play out. There's pretty good. Then you want to hold that screw and tighten down that jam nut. So once this is all assembled, there's a couple adjustments you can make to try to get as much play out of this as possible. You see right now, it still has some play in it. You want to put the pitman arm on and make sure it's tightened up well. You don't want any slop between that and the shaft. So this is all between the worm and sector gear. And the way you adjust that is by loosening these up and turning that eccentric nut, and that'll move the whole thing to try to tighten up that gap in there. And you may also have to what they call centralize your sector shaft on the worm gear. To centralize this on the worm gear, that's what this other little slotted thing down here we messed with before, that's what that's for. So what you want to do is center your steering and then go, I think it's a half a turn one way and a half a turn the other way, and check your play in this arm at both of those. And if it's more on one side than the other, then you'd adjust this to centralize it. The way you do this is you center your steering. It's pretty easy because the steering is just about exactly 3 turns lock to lock. So you just go to one lock, turn it back 1.5 turns, and you're there. Now the way you do that is from center you go a half turn in one direction. Let's go left first. And now you measure your end play, or you measure the amount of play in your pitman arm. So just take a tape measure, try to stabilize it against something. I'll use the tripod here. So we got about 1/4 of an inch of play. at the end of the pitman arm. So about 1/4 inch. Now we'll turn the steering wheel back a half turn from center to in the other direction. All right, so now we're a half a turn from center to the left. So you want to do the same thing. Or just measure a point, try to stabilize as much as you can. So again, we got about 1/4 inch. So it's pretty much centralized between the two gears. So that adjustment's good. So the last adjustment on that to try to take this play out of here is you loosen up all 4 of those mounting nuts. And the one with the eccentric, the adjusting thing on it, I actually took the lock washer out because it hinders your ability to get a wrench on the actual adjusting eccentric. So I take that off, put the nut back on. You don't want it tight, but you don't want it backed way off either. So now get your 7/8 wrench on that eccentric. You want to just slowly turn this in a clockwise direction, a little bit at a time, to try to get the play out of that sector shaft. Getting there slowly. What you don't want to do is go too far. You don't want to go back. You want to come at it from the counterclockwise direction in a clockwise direction. If you go too far, you want to creep back up on it. If that makes any sense. It's getting pretty close. I've been monkeying with this for a little while, and all of this stuff is used. It probably wouldn't hurt to have a new sector shaft. I don't have any plans of doing that. I think this will be fine the way it is. But because everything is used and has a little bit of wear, you may have to go back and forth on that adjustment a few times, which I did. As you tighten down the other housing bolts, it kind of changes it. So just because it feels good on the initial adjustment, once you start tightening everything else down, it can change, which kept happening to me. So right now, it still has a tiny bit of play in it. I'm fine with that. It's a balance between having play in it and the steering binding, and I'd rather have a little bit of play and no binding than the other way around. So I think that's pretty decent. I'm going to go with that, and now we're going to start putting the rest of this thing back together. Now this next part will address the more common issue, which is the leak out of the bottom around the horn shaft. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the replacement piece, and if you're going to do anything, you can do this in the vehicle. So I would definitely replace this. I would not use the original one. The original piece is just this flat end piece. So the way that would seal is you have this gasket. This would seal against the housing. And then there's a little rubber seal that would seal between this metal housing and this shaft. With this tube on here now, you don't need this rubber seal anymore, and there's no way for oil to get down between this shaft and this housing. So definitely throw away your original piece. Use this. They're not that expensive. You get that on there, this end cap goes on, just bolts all together like that. So I'm going to throw this together, then we'll come right back and I'll show you how to put the spring and the clip on this, and then it'll be all ready to go back in the car. So the end plate's on, this little end cap is on. You want to make sure this notch is pointed towards the bottom of the box so that your headlight switch will line up correctly. Next you want your horn rod in. You've got this spring that goes on, goes up in the housing like that. And you've got this piece which runs your headlight switch. This can be a little bit of a pain in the ass. It just slides up onto the horn rod. And you've got this clip that goes up into this groove. Now you have to try to keep the horn rod from pushing back out while you're doing this. So you just compress the spring, and there's not a ton of tension on it, so it's not real bad, but still a little tricky to get in here sometimes. And that clip sits on there if you can get it on there. Just like that. So make sure your horn rod spins freely. So Now you're all good to put it back in the car. So the last thing we're going to address is this other kit we looked at. This most likely doesn't need this because of this seal that's in here. My only concern is that obviously the sector shaft is used. If it has some wear, it may not seal 100%. I'm 99% sure that it's going to seal just fine. But while I have it apart, while I have it right here, and I have several of these kits, I'm just going to throw one of these on here for the hell of it. So it's pretty simple. Again, this already has some oil on it because I put it together that way. But you want to put a little bit of oil on this. Unless your thing is still leaking a lot, then it will oil itself. It won't really matter. So throw a little oil on the seal. Slide it down on there like that. And then this just slides on. And when you put it through the frame, that'll just push up against that and seal that up a little bit better. Like I said, I'm fairly certain this doesn't actually need it, but where I'm here, I just want to make sure. Plus, it just shows you how to put it on. Got the steering box all reinstalled and filled up. I've got plenty of other work to do on this car, so it's going to be a little while before it goes anywhere. That'll give us quite a bit of time to keep an eye on it, see if there's any leaks, but I'm pretty confident at this point that we've resolved all the leaking issues. Well, hopefully this video will help you to resolve your leaky box issues and maybe save you some embarrassment from, leaving puddles at your friend's house or spots in the parking lot at your local grocery store. There's just no reason for you to be running around town with a leaky box. I appreciate you watching, and as always, if you guys are into that whole social media thing, check down in the description there. I've got links to our Spacegram and Twitter book and all that good stuff, so go ahead and check that out. Be sure to check back in next week for our next video.